The sun beat down relentlessly on the city, its heat making the asphalt shimmer with a mirage of illusion. Downtown was a jungle of honking cars, hurried pedestrians, and the constant hum of urban life. But for 12-year-old Malik Carter, it was just another unforgiving day. He moved through the streets like a ghost, unnoticed and unseen, a mere shadow among the thousands of people who brushed past him without a second glance. His sneakers were worn, the soles barely hanging on, and his oversized jacket flapped loosely around his thin frame. The old backpack slung over his shoulder was a constant companion, filled with scraps of his life. Nothing of value, but everything he had. Malik had learned early on that in this world, people like him didn't matter. He didn't belong to a family, didn't have a home to return to at night. The cold concrete was his bed, the alleyways his shelter, and the sidewalk his path. His mother had left years ago, and his father? Malik didn't know where he was, or if he'd ever been there to begin with. What he did know was survival. He learned to hide, to stay out of sight, to not draw attention to himself. People might offer a look of pity when they saw him, but most didn't care enough to offer help. They saw him as just another street kid, a nuisance, a part of the scenery, nothing more. Today was like every other day. He wandered through the streets, trying to stay out of trouble while searching for something to eat. Maybe there'd be a leftover sandwich from the cafe, or a forgotten bag of chips in the trash. Maybe there'd be a kind soul who would slip him a few dollars or a hot dog from the cart. Maybe. He wasn't going to get his hopes up. In this city, hope was something that was hard to come by. As Malik passed by the shiny storefronts and the shiny people who walked by with their fancy clothes and shiny smiles, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. They lived in a world where money and privilege were the currency, and he didn't have either. But it wasn't new. He was used to it. He had learned to accept it. But it still stung sometimes, still made his stomach turn when he looked up at the gleaming glass buildings that reached for the sky, towering above him, just out of reach. Malik knew the game well by now. Stay unnoticed, keep moving, don't engage with anyone, don't draw attention. The best thing a kid like him could do was blend in. He had perfected the art of invisibility over the years. People might glance at him and look away, uncomfortable with the reality of a child living like this, but they'd never stop. They'd never ask if he was okay or if he needed help. He wasn't their problem. That's how the world worked, wasn't it? The haves and the have-nots. The people with money and power and the people with nothing. Those with everything would never notice those with nothing, as long as they stayed out of the way. Malik had learned that lesson young. He knew that nothing he did would ever change the way the world saw him. He wasn't supposed to be seen. He wasn't supposed to matter. The heat of the sun on his neck didn't help either. It made everything feel heavier, like the weight of the city was pressing down on his shoulders. The sweat on his forehead dripped down, and his stomach growled with hunger, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything today. His eyes scanned the street, darting from corner to corner, trying to spot something that would ease his hunger, even if just for a moment. But everything seemed out of reach. People walked by with their expensive coffees, their bags of groceries, their carefree lives, and here he was, just trying to survive. Malik's fingers brushed against the strap of his backpack, feeling the rough fabric, his constant companion. Inside were scraps of paper, an old pencil, and a photo of his mother, her smiling face now a faded memory. He clutched it for a moment, letting the coolness of the paper settle in his palm. It was the only thing he had left of her, the only thing that reminded him of what he used to have, before the world turned its back on him. He sighed, his gaze drifting to the horizon. It was another day, just like the rest. Another day of being invisible. Another day of surviving. And as he continued down the street, weaving in and out of the crowd, he hoped for something, anything, that would give him a glimpse of a different life. One where he didn't have to be invisible anymore. But deep down, he knew better. Hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. But today, something was different. Today, the world was about to see him. Malik slowed his steps as his eyes caught sight of something that didn't belong in his world. A woman, crumpled against the side of a dumpster in a dark alley, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. The heat of the day made the air around her thick, and her labored breaths were the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Her clothes were expensive but wrinkled. The fabric of her blazer stretched tightly against her frame. Her face was pale, drained of color, as if she hadn't had a proper meal or sleep in days. There was a gun holster strapped to her waist, its dark metal gleaming faintly in the dim light. But she didn't make any moves to reach for it. She was too weak, too vulnerable. Malik's stomach turned, but it wasn't from fear or uncertainty. It was the gut-wrenching feeling that something wasn't right, something deeper than just the woman's condition. And then his eyes caught the most shocking detail of all, a gold badge clipped to her belt. FBI. Malik's chest tightened. He had seen people in trouble before, many of them in worse conditions than this. Some you helped, others you simply walked away from. People who had been in his world for years, people who were broken, people who couldn't be helped. But this woman, she wasn't drunk, she wasn't high, she wasn't like the others. She was running from something. The realization hit Malik like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some random victim on the streets. This woman had a story, one that was clearly bigger than him. She was an agent, someone with real power, someone with answers to questions he couldn't even begin to ask. Her hand, trembling with effort, cradled her stomach protectively, and the sight made his heart skip a beat. She was pregnant. "Help me." The words barely escaped her lips. She was struggling, her body on the edge of exhaustion, her face contorted with pain. Malik took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew this moment was different. The city had given him enough reasons to close off, to stay quiet, to avoid getting involved. He knew that helping sometimes brought trouble, brought attention, brought danger. But his feet were already planted, his eyes locked on her. He had learned that sometimes helping was the only option. His instincts told him to leave, to walk away, to avoid whatever storm had brought this woman to the brink of death. She wasn't part of his world. She wasn't someone he could trust, not in a city like this. But his heart wouldn't let him walk away. Something in him snapped. He had seen too many people walk away from others who needed help. He wasn't going to be one of them, not this time. He didn't know what was going to happen next. He didn't know who was chasing her or what trouble she was mixed up in. He didn't know if this would drag him into something dangerous. But what he did know was that she needed him. And for once in his life he felt like he could make a difference. His heart hammered in his chest as he took one step forward, then another, his legs trembling as adrenaline surged through him. He reached down, careful not to startle her, and gently placed his hand on her arm. Her body flinched slightly at his touch, but her eyes flickered toward him, her lips parting in a weak, desperate attempt to speak again. Malik leaned in closer. "I'm here to help," he said, his voice calm, steady, though his heart felt anything but. Her eyes met his, and in that instant Malik saw something that took him by surprise. Trust. It was as if the woman, despite everything she'd been through, believed in him. Maybe it was the desperation in her gaze, or maybe, just maybe, it was the simple fact that, in this cold city, someone had finally seen her. He reached into his backpack, pulling out the small first aid kit he kept with him. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He quickly set to work, trying to do what he could to stop the bleeding and ease her pain. His mind raced as he worked. He didn't know if he was doing enough. He didn't know what the consequences would be for helping someone like her. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to leave her to die on this filthy pavement. She was depending on him. Would you have helped? Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Drop a comment below. Malik's heart raced as the woman's body went limp in his arms. Panic surged through him and his mind struggled to keep up. He could feel her warmth draining, could see the fear in her eyes before she lost consciousness. "Ma'am, you gotta wake up," he whispered urgently, shaking her gently, but there was no response. Her head lolled against his arm. The words she managed to mutter before slipping into unconsciousness replayed in his head. They'll find me. Who? He didn't know what she meant, but the fear in her voice was unmistakable. Whoever she was running from, they were close. And if she was telling the truth, whoever it was wouldn't stop until they found her. Before he could think through what to do next, the sound of a black SUV screeching to a stop pierced the silence. The screech of the tires made his stomach twist, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow. The SUV's doors slammed open, followed by the heavy sound of footsteps on the pavement. He turned his head quickly, eyes narrowing as he saw the silhouettes of men in dark suits stepping out of the vehicle, scanning the alley with sharp, trained eyes. They were looking for something, or someone. Malik's breath caught in his throat. Were these the people the woman had been running from? His gut told him yes. His instincts screamed at him to get out of sight, to duck behind the dumpster or flee the alley completely. But the woman, she was still there, helpless, unconscious. She needed him. He couldn't leave her, not like this. He quickly glanced at her again, her breathing shallow but steady. She wasn't dead yet. But he had no idea how much time they had before those men found them. Malik's eyes flicked between the men and the woman. He wasn't sure who they were, but they had the kind of presence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. They were looking for someone, and they weren't just going to walk away. His mind raced with options, none of them good. He wasn't strong enough to fight them off. He couldn't outrun them. His only option was to get her out of there, but where? He had nowhere to go, nowhere safe. His gaze moved back to the SUV. It was parked too close, and the men were too close to the alley's entrance. He had to move quickly, or they would be on him before he could even think. Malik's hand tightened around the woman's shoulder, his fingers gripping her, trying to shake her awake, but she stayed limp. His heart pounded louder in his chest, threatening to burst free. What was he supposed to do? Run. That's what his gut told him. But where? He had no plan, no backup. He was just a kid. He wasn't supposed to be in situations like this. He was supposed to stay out of trouble, stay invisible. But the problem was, the trouble had found him. Then the decision hit him hard. There was only one thing he could do. He couldn't run away. He wasn't going to let them take her. But he also couldn't stay. So he ran toward safety, but not in the way he'd expected. Not away from danger, but right past it. He could see a narrow passageway between two buildings just up ahead, a small alleyway leading toward a set of stairs that might take him to the roof. It was risky, but it was the only chance they had. His heart thudding, he carefully scooped the woman up, lifting her into his arms. He grimaced at the weight, his legs straining under the effort, but he didn't care. He had to move. The men were getting closer now, and their voices could be heard murmuring about the alley. They were on high alert. He didn't wait. He ran toward the passageway as fast as his legs could carry him, careful not to trip over anything in his way. He heard footsteps behind him, but he didn't dare look back. The sound of men shouting in frustration only spurred him on. "Come on, come on," he muttered to himself, feeling his legs burn with the effort. He had to get her somewhere safe, somewhere the men couldn't find them. Finally, they reached the stairs. Without hesitating, he began to climb, his arms aching from holding the woman. The weight was almost unbearable, but he forced himself to keep going, step by step. At the top of the building, he stopped, gasping for air. The rooftop was empty, silent. No one followed them. Elijah set the woman down gently, catching his breath. He looked down at her, the weight of what he had just done pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had chosen to run, to protect someone, even when it was the hardest thing to do. As the sounds of pursuit died down below, he collapsed next to her, staring at the darkening sky, wondering if his choice had been the right one. Have you ever been falsely accused? Have you ever faced racism? Share your story in the comments. We want to hear from you. Malik's breath came in ragged gasps as he dragged the unconscious FBI agent through the alley, his legs burning with effort. He had no choice but to keep moving. He had made the decision. He was going to save her, and he was going to make sure she was safe. His arms ached from carrying her, but he wasn't about to stop. Not when they were so close. The sound of his sneakers slapping against the pavement echoed in the alleyway as he stumbled forward, trying to find shelter, trying to find help. He needed a place to go, somewhere they could hide until the men who were chasing them were gone. And then he saw it. A small convenience store, its flickering fluorescent lights spilling out onto the sidewalk. The store was his only chance. He rushed forward, his pulse racing, the weight of the woman in his arms feeling like 100 pounds. His chest tightened and his mind raced with what he had just done, what he was about to do. No time to think, just move. As he pushed through the door, the sound of the bell above the entrance chimed, making the elderly man behind the counter jump. He turned, his eyes wide, as he saw Malik stumbling through the door with the woman in his arms. "Call the cops! She's FBI!" Malik shouted, his voice raw, desperate. The clerk blinked in confusion, his hand frozen over the phone. For a moment, everything stood still. Malik's eyes locked with the old man's, pleading with him to act. The clerk's gaze flickered between the boy and the woman in his arms. Then, without a word, he grabbed the phone and dialed. The seconds felt like hours. Every passing moment felt like it might be too late. Finally, the sound of sirens filled the air, cutting through the silence like a knife. Police were on their way. Malik dared not look out the window, afraid that the men in suits would be there, chasing after him. It didn't take long for the store to fill with the sound of distant sirens, growing louder by the second. Malik's heart pounded as he waited, praying they wouldn't be too late. The moments dragged on, the anticipation heavy in the air. Just as the sirens reached a deafening crescendo, the front door slammed open. Officers poured into the store, their guns drawn. Malik froze. The world stopped. They weren't here to thank him. They weren't here to acknowledge the boy who had just saved an FBI agent's life. Number. They didn't see a hero. They saw a black boy standing with a white woman in his arms. "Get your hands up," one officer shouted, his voice booming with authority. Malik's heart raced. His mind screamed at him to move, but his body didn't respond. His hands, still gripping the FBI agent's limp form, were frozen in place. He hadn't done anything wrong, but this was the moment everything could go wrong. This was the moment his whole life could change, and not for the better. The officer's eyes scanned him with distrust, and Malik felt his stomach drop. His body was shaking, but he held his ground. His fingers twitched, still gripping the agent's unconscious form. He could hear the officers' voices barking orders, but all he could focus on was their eyes filled with suspicion and hostility. He wanted to explain. He wanted to shout that he wasn't the enemy, that he was the one who saved the woman, that he wasn't a threat. But the words wouldn't come. His chest felt tight, and his throat was dry. The longer he stood there, the more he felt like he was drowning in their judgment. And then, something unexpected happened. One of the officers, a woman with short blonde hair, took a step forward. Her eyes softened just a fraction as she looked at Malik. Then, without a word, she glanced at the woman in his arms, the FBI agent who was still unconscious, her face pale. She nodded to the other officers, signaling them to lower their weapons. For a split second, Malik dared to hope. "Is she okay?" the officer asked quietly. Malik nodded, his breath shaky. "She's just unconscious. I think she's been attacked. I don't know, but they were after her." The officer turned to the other officers, giving them a signal to back off. They hesitated, still unsure, but slowly lowered their weapons. Malik exhaled in relief, the weight on his chest lifting for the first time since the chase began. The officer walked toward him, her expression softer now. "What's your name, son?" "Malik," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't believe what was happening. They weren't pointing guns at him anymore. They weren't yelling. For the first time that night, he felt a sliver of hope. The officer nodded. "You did the right thing. You saved her life." She paused. "We'll take it from here." Malik watched as they took the woman from his arms, the officers moving with precision, their demeanor now calm, even respectful. But as they turned to leave, the officer who had spoken to him glanced back. "You should go. This isn't your fight anymore." Malik hesitated, glancing around at the store and then at the officers. He wasn't sure where to go, but he knew he couldn't stay there forever. As the officers turned to attend to the woman, he slipped out of the door, back into the night, his heart still racing. It was over, for now. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but for one brief moment he had done something right. And no one could take that from him. Have you ever been falsely accused? Have you ever faced racism? Share your story in the comments. We want to hear from you. A week later, Malek sat in his new apartment, looking around in awe. The walls were freshly painted, the floors clean and smooth beneath his feet. There was a bed in the corner, a real bed, with soft sheets and pillows. No more hard floors, no more cold nights. For the first time in years, Malik felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was living. The sounds of the city still echoed from outside, but inside, it was quiet, peaceful. He didn't have to worry about being chased away from a corner or a bench. This place was his. It was warm, safe, and, for the first time, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Agent Brooks had been the one to make this possible. She'd come to visit him earlier that day, her face filled with gratitude and relief. She'd thanked him over and over for saving her life and had insisted on helping him find a place to stay. At first, Malik had been hesitant. People didn't just offer help for free, not in his world. But she had insisted, her kindness real, not empty like so many others. Malik hadn't fully understood why Agent Brooks cared so much, why she'd gone out of her way to make sure he had a future. But now, sitting in this apartment, everything she had done for him felt like a gift he would never be able to repay. He didn't even know where to start. How could he thank someone for changing his life? Agent Brooks had said it again, right before she left. "You're a hero, Malik." The words hung in the air, but they didn't feel right. He was just a kid, just someone trying to make it through the day. Heroes didn't come from places like his, did they? They didn't come from alleyways or street corners. But as Malik stood in the middle of his apartment, looking out of the window at the city that once felt so distant, something inside him began to shift. Maybe he wasn't invisible anymore. Maybe people had started seeing him for who he was, not just a street kid, but someone who could make a difference, someone who had done the right thing when it counted. He thought back to that night, the panic in Agent Brooks's eyes, the tension in the air, the moment when he chose to help, when he chose to act. It felt like a lifetime ago, but the memory stayed fresh in his mind. In that moment, he had done something that changed everything. For her, for him. As he stood there, staring out at the city, Malik whispered to himself, "Maybe I was never invisible. Maybe they just weren't looking." For the first time in his life, he didn't feel overlooked. He didn't feel forgotten. There was still so much of the world that Malik didn't understand, but in this moment, he knew one thing for sure. He was seen, and that meant everything. The sounds of the city outside seemed less overwhelming now. The hustle and bustle felt like part of something bigger. He wasn't just a part of the background noise anymore. He had a purpose, a future, and for once, he wasn't alone. Malik's eyes moved to the photo of his mother that he kept on the small desk by the window. He hadn't seen her in years, and while his life wasn't perfect, he felt like he could finally be someone she would be proud of. He still didn't know exactly where this journey would take him, but for the first time, Malik didn't feel like the world was closing in on him. It was opening up. Maybe things can be different, he thought to himself. As the sunlight faded from the horizon, Malik sat down on his bed, his back straight. The apartment was quiet, but it felt right. The future was uncertain, but for once Malik was ready to face it.